The story you are about to hear does not begin on a battlefield filled with smoke and gunfire, but with something deceptively simple, something that sounds almost strange for a conflict that shook European politics: pigs. Yet behind these pigs lay pride, power, money, and the struggle of a small nation trying to break free from the grip of a mighty empire. Imagine a region already tense, where alliances are forming, where nationalism is rising, and where every tariff, every trade route, every treaty starts to feel like a move on a giant chessboard. As the clock ticks toward 1906, the Balkans are alive with rumor and uncertainty, and Serbia, newly energized under a new king after 1903, is ready to challenge Austria-Hungary's dominance. This is where our journey begins, not with armies charging, but with borders closing, markets collapsing, and leaders calculating their every step in silence. People at the time did not know this economic conflict would help fuel deeper hatred, grow nationalism, and contribute to the tensions that would one day drag the world toward war. They only knew that suddenly, something vital to their daily lives was being used as a weapon. For years before the Pig War, Serbia existed under the economic shadow of Austria-Hungary. Around 80 to 90% of Serbian exports went to Austria-Hungary, and more than half of Serbia's imports came from there as well. This meant Serbia sold most of its livestock, especially pigs, across that border, and depended heavily on Austrian markets and transport. To ordinary Serbian farmers, pigs were not just animals, they were livelihood, food, and trade. To politicians, they were revenue, bargaining power, and control. Austria-Hungary understood this dependence very well and used it to keep Serbia economically tied and politically obedient. But in 1903 everything began to change. A new king took power in Serbia, and with this new leadership came new ambitions. Serbia wanted independence not only in flags and speeches but in real power, economic, political, and regional. It no longer wanted to live as a small neighbor constantly under the pressure of a giant empire telling it where to sell and from whom to buy. The Austro-Serb commercial treaty that had long regulated trade was nearing its end. Negotiations for renewal began, but they were anything but friendly. Austria-Hungary wanted to maintain its grip. Serbia wanted to loosen it. Talks stalled, bitterness grew, and both sides began preparing for confrontation, not with armies, but with tariffs and trade barriers that could hurt just as deeply. Serbia made a bold symbolic move in January 1904, ordering munitions not from the usual Austrian supplier but from a French firm. This was more than a purchase. It was a message. Serbia was signaling it had other friends, other options, other roads forward. Austria-Hungary noticed this immediately and did not like what it saw. Every Serbian step toward independence was seen as a threat, and every Austrian reaction made Serbian nationalism burn hotter. Then came another turning point in 1905. Serbia and Bulgaria formed a customs union, creating a stronger economic partnership that completely disrupted trade negotiations with Austria-Hungary. To Vienna, this was a slap in the face, proof that Serbia was drifting away from its influence and building relationships that might change the balance of power in the Balkans. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Diplomats exchanged cold words. Newspapers stirred public emotions. Behind closed doors, leaders calculated whether pressure, threats, or economic punishment would force Serbia back under control. The decision was soon made. On March 1, 1906, the border closed to Serbian pigs. What looked like a simple sanitary or tariff action was in reality a powerful attempt to break Serbia economically. And thus began what history remembers as the Pig War. For Serbia, this moment felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. Overnight, its main export market disappeared. Farmers worried that their animals, once worth money, would become worthless. Trade routes stalled, wagons stopped, and uncertainty spread through villages and towns. But instead of collapsing, Serbia did something unexpected. It adapted. Determined not to surrender to Austrian pressure, it searched for new partners. New markets were opened, particularly in France and Germany, and credits were obtained to build slaughterhouses and canning plants. Serbia started to modernize its meat industry instead of depending on live export alone. Foreign trade actually increased by about 10 million dinars. What Austria-Hungary had hoped would weaken Serbia ended up pushing it toward greater independence and efficiency. This outcome only fueled deeper resentment and strengthened the Serbian will. Yet beneath this economic struggle, something far more serious was building. Trade conflict slowly became political hatred. Serbia's desire for access to the Adriatic Sea grew stronger, and its ambitions toward Bosnia sharpened. Austria-Hungary, in turn, saw Serbia as a growing danger that threatened the stability of its Balkan territories. The Pig War may have been fought with tariffs and customs barriers instead of guns and shells, but it helped set the emotional and political stage for the storms that would follow in the years leading to the First World War. It showed how economic weapons could wound relationships, how pride could harden diplomacy, and how even pigs could become symbols of resistance and control. And this is only the beginning of this suspenseful and very real historical drama, where every decision taken in silence echoed across Europe. As the Pig War moved beyond its dramatic beginning, the deeper political game being played in Europe became clearer, like a map slowly lighting up with hidden motives and ambitions. Nothing about this conflict was accidental. Austria-Hungary believed that by closing its borders to Serbian pigs and products, it could choke Serbia's economy and force it back into dependency. This empire had long viewed Serbia as a troublesome neighbor whose rising nationalism could inspire others inside its own diverse territories, especially among Slavs. The Habsburg leadership feared that if Serbia grew stronger, it might encourage independence movements within Austria-Hungary's borders, threatening the survival of the empire itself. So when Serbia sought new markets and began forming customs agreements with Bulgaria and dealing with France and Germany, Vienna saw not normal trade, but a dangerous political shift. The Balkans were already called the powder keg of Europe, and every diplomatic move felt like someone shaking that keg a little harder. Meanwhile, inside Serbia, the population felt both insulted and awakened. Newspapers portrayed the Austrian blockade as an attack on national dignity, not only on pigs or trade. Political speeches became more fiery, telling people that Serbia must stand on its own feet and no longer live under Austrian economic chains. The new king's government promoted the idea that Serbia had a mission in the Balkans, a destiny tied to uniting Slavic peoples and reaching the Adriatic Sea. The Pig War became proof that Austria-Hungary would never willingly allow Serbia true independence. This belief strengthened nationalist groups that would later become key players in events leading toward the assassination at Sarajevo and the outbreak of World War I. What looked like a tariff conflict was feeding emotions that would reshape Europe. As months turned into years, the economic struggle changed daily life in Serbia. At first, there were moments of fear. Farmers saw markets vanish overnight, and traders wondered whether their businesses would survive. Yet instead of the collapse Austria-Hungary expected, Serbia transformed. It negotiated loans from French banks, built modern slaughterhouses, and expanded its canning industry so that meat could be exported even without sending live animals across the Austro-Hungarian border. German companies provided imports that once came from Austria-Hungary, creating new trade routes and diplomatic ties. Each successful adaptation was like a small victory, showing the Serbian public that they did not have to rely on Vienna to survive. This new confidence became politically powerful, and it worried Austria-Hungary even more. The Pig War also revealed how economics and politics are closely connected in international relations. Every train car blocked, every tariff raised, every shipment redirected carried political meaning. Behind closed doors, diplomats spoke in coded language, but the reality was simple. Austria-Hungary wanted obedience, Serbia wanted respect and autonomy. Other European powers watched carefully. Russia, as a protector of Slavic interests, sympathized with Serbia and saw opportunities to expand its own influence in the Balkans. France welcomed Serbian trade as part of its larger rivalry with Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany, though allied with Austria-Hungary, also engaged in Serbian trade when it benefited economically. In this way, a conflict named after pigs quietly pulled multiple great powers into a web of interests that would later explode on a far larger scale. Suspense in this story does not come from sudden charges across a battlefield but from the slow tightening of political tension. People living during those years could feel that something larger was building beneath the surface. The border closure lasted not for weeks but for years, from 1906 to 1909, and every year hardened attitudes on both sides. Serbia's search for an outlet to the Adriatic Sea became not just an economic desire but a national dream. Bosnia, still under Austro-Hungarian control, sat directly in the path of that dream. Serbian politicians and nationalists increasingly spoke of Bosnia as naturally linked to Serbia through ethnicity and culture. Austria-Hungary, hearing such claims, became even more determined to keep Serbia contained. A struggle that began with livestock now pointed directly toward disputes over land, identity, and empire. As the Pig War continued, ordinary people experienced its effects in ways that statistics alone cannot describe. Farmers had to learn new markets and new requirements. Workers in newly built factories handled canned meat shipped farther abroad. Merchants adapted their routes, and conversations in cafes and homes revolved around rumors of price changes, new agreements, and political speeches. Every change in tariff or policy affected real families, just as surely as battles affect soldiers. But what makes this period especially dramatic is the sense of silent build-up. The world around Serbia and Austria-Hungary seemed peaceful on the surface, with no official armies marching against each other, yet emotionally and politically, both sides were arming themselves with anger and ambition. The Pig War taught Serbia that it could resist economic pressure, and it taught Austria-Hungary that Serbia might not be easily controlled. Lessons like these have consequences. By the time the conflict neared its end in 1909, its results were already visible. Serbia had diversified its trade, increased its foreign commerce by millions of dinars, and reduced its reliance on Austria-Hungary. This economic independence translated into political confidence and stronger nationalism. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, had succeeded only in fueling hostility instead of submission. In Vienna's attempt to weaken Serbia, it had helped create a tougher opponent. And all of this unfolded without a formal military clash, proving that wars are not always fought with bullets. Sometimes they are fought with markets, treaties, and blockades that cut just as deeply into the life of a nation. The suspense of this story lies in knowing what would soon follow, that only a few years after this tariff conflict ended, Europe would be dragged into the greatest war it had ever seen, and the tensions sharpened during the Pig War would play their part in that tragedy. As we move deeper into the years of the Pig War, the story becomes even more intense, because what began as a tariff dispute slowly turned into a test of survival and national identity for Serbia, and a test of authority for Austria-Hungary. The middle phase of the conflict was not about sudden dramatic moments, but about long, grinding pressure that forced both sides to reveal who they really were. Austria-Hungary believed time was on its side. It expected Serbia to bend, to return quietly to the old trade agreements, and to accept economic dependence as an unchangeable reality. Instead, the opposite happened. With every month that passed, Serbia learned new ways to live without Austrian markets. It redirected live pigs to other countries, expanded slaughterhouses so meat could be preserved and transported farther, and negotiated fresh trade agreements. Each of these steps made the conflict harder for Austria-Hungary to win, because economic weapons lose power when the target adapts to them. In the middle of the Pig War, diplomacy in Europe took on a sharper edge. Negotiations no longer sounded like routine trade talks, they carried the tone of rivalry and suspicion. Serbian leaders were increasingly convinced that Austria-Hungary's true goal was not just economic pressure, but political control. They worried that if Serbia gave in now, it would remain trapped forever, unable to act independently in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, saw Serbian independence as a danger that could infect other Slavic groups inside its own empire, encouraging demands for autonomy or even separation. So both sides began thinking in terms larger than tariffs. They were thinking about the future shape of Southeast Europe. Every customs decision now sat on top of deeper questions. Who would dominate the Balkans? Whose voice would matter in regional politics? Would small states like Serbia be allowed to rise, or would empires crush them before they could grow? This middle period was also the time when the real costs of the conflict became visible. Economic wars do not produce dramatic casualty figures like battles do, but they do leave scars. Farmers who had once relied on the Austrian market had to change everything about how they worked, from how they raised animals to how they transported them. Some businesses failed, others struggled, and many families lived with uncertainty, not knowing whether the new trade agreements would hold. Prices shifted, supply lines changed, and with them came anxiety. But there was also resilience. Serbia's ability to increase overall foreign trade by millions of dinars during the conflict proved that hardship could be transformed into opportunity with determination, foreign loans, and strategic planning. New industries were born around slaughterhouses and canning factories, creating jobs that had not existed before the crisis. The very weapon Austria-Hungary used against Serbia ended up helping to modernize the Serbian economy. At the same time, the Pig War intensified nationalist feelings, and that is where the real danger lay. Middle phases of conflicts are often when emotions harden, when temporary disagreements turn into long-term hostilities. Serbian newspapers and politicians emphasized that Austria-Hungary had tried to economically strangle their nation, treating it like a dependent province rather than a sovereign state. This strengthened the belief that Serbia had to fight for respect, not just in trade but in territory and influence. The desire for access to the Adriatic Sea grew stronger, because Serbia saw clearly that being landlocked made it vulnerable to anyone who controlled its trade routes. Bosnia, lying under Austro-Hungarian rule and inhabited by many South Slavs, became the focus of Serbian national imagination. The Pig War did not create these ambitions, but it sharpened them and made them feel urgent. Austria-Hungary, interpreting these ambitions as threats to its own stability, became even more suspicious and hostile toward Serbia. The suspense of this phase comes from watching two powers move closer to a future confrontation without yet realizing how far it would eventually go. There were no armies clashing, no cannons firing, but there was a sense that something larger was approaching. Serbia's alliances and trade connections were shifting toward Western Europe and Russia, while Austria-Hungary tightened its diplomatic circle with Germany. The Pig War acted like a rehearsal for later crises, teaching leaders how far they could push, how much pressure they could apply, and how the other side might respond. These lessons would echo dangerously in the years ahead. The middle of the Pig War was, in many ways, the middle of a much bigger story, the gradual breakdown of trust and cooperation in Europe before World War I. By 1908 and 1909, both sides understood that the situation could not continue forever. Austria-Hungary had failed to break Serbia economically, and Serbia had paid a high price but emerged stronger, more independent, and more determined. Trade had been redirected, industries built, and national pride inflamed. The human cost was measured not in battlefield graves but in years of uncertainty, financial stress, and deepening hostility. The Pig War showed Europe that even without firing a shot, nations could injure one another and reshape politics through economic measures alone. It also proved that Serbia, small but stubborn, would not simply accept its place beneath Austria-Hungary. This realization would haunt European diplomacy, because when a great empire sees a small nation refusing to bow, the stage is often set for future conflict, and what happened after 1909 would soon confirm how dangerous that reality was. As the Pig War approached its later phase, the consequences of 3 years of economic conflict were fully visible, and they reached far beyond the numbers recorded in trade reports or customs records. By now, Serbia was no longer the same country that had entered the crisis in 1906. It had been forced to rethink its economy, its alliances, and its place in Europe, and those changes could not be undone simply by reopening a border. Austria-Hungary, too, was changed. The empire had discovered that its economic pressure could not bend Serbia to its will, and that realization produced a mixture of frustration and fear. An empire that had once been confident in its power now saw that even small neighbors could resist if nationalism and foreign support stood behind them. This recognition was dangerous, because frustrated empires often respond not by compromise but by planning harder and harsher strategies for the future. In the shadows of diplomacy, conversations were already turning from tariffs to the possibility of force, and from trade routes to territorial control. By the late years of the conflict, the damage caused by the Pig War was not only economic but psychological. Austria-Hungary and Serbia no longer viewed each other simply as trading partners with disagreements. They saw each other as rivals for power and influence in the Balkans. Serbian hostility toward Austria-Hungary had intensified to the point that it became part of public identity. Songs, speeches, and newspaper articles treated resistance to Vienna as a patriotic duty. Austria-Hungary, for its part, began to look at Serbia not as a manageable neighbor, but as a source of instability that encouraged unrest among the Slavic peoples inside the empire. Each side blamed the other for poisoning relations, and each side felt increasingly justified in distrust. This kind of deep emotional damage is often more dangerous than economic loss because it shapes how nations react during future crises, sometimes pushing them toward decisions that seem inevitable rather than chosen. During this late period, Serbia's ambitions also became clearer and more focused. The search for access to the Adriatic Sea turned into a strategic goal, not just a dream. Without a coastline, Serbia depended heavily on neighbors for trade routes, and the Pig War had demonstrated how risky that dependence could be. A direct outlet to the sea meant independence in trade, military strategy, and diplomacy. But geography made this desire immediately controversial. Bosnia and Herzegovina, under Austro-Hungarian administration, stood in the way of Serbia's easy expansion toward the coast. Many Serbs believed that these territories were culturally and historically connected to Serbia. Austria-Hungary feared that Serbian claims over Bosnia could inspire rebellion among its own subjects and weaken its control. The Pig War therefore intensified a territorial question that would soon explode in the Bosnian crisis of 1908 to 1909, when Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, shocking Serbia and further deepening hostility. Meanwhile, the broader European scene became more tangled, adding layers of tension around the Pig War. Russia positioned itself as a protector of Slavic interests, sympathizing with Serbia and opposing Austro-Hungarian expansion. France supported Serbia economically and politically as part of its rivalry with the Central Powers. Germany stood by Austria-Hungary but also recognized that Serbia was no longer economically isolated. The Balkans became a crossroads where multiple great powers tested their influence. The Pig War might have looked like a local tariff dispute, but its geopolitical meaning had become much larger. It revealed to Europe that small conflicts in the Balkans could draw in mighty empires and trigger chain reactions, none of them fully controlled. The phrase powder keg of Europe became more than a metaphor. It became a warning that the region held enough tension to ignite a continent-wide catastrophe. The losses from the Pig War were therefore measured on many levels. Economically, both sides suffered distortions in trade. Serbia experienced years of uncertainty, rapid restructuring, and periods of hardship for farmers and merchants. Austria-Hungary lost a market and strained diplomatic relations, but more importantly, it lost the illusion that Serbia could be easily dominated through economic tools alone. Politically, trust between the two nations was shattered. Diplomats spoke more sharply, public opinion hardened, and the possibility of peaceful cooperation shrank. Emotionally and socially, entire populations were drawn into the conflict, not as soldiers but as citizens whose daily lives were shaped by distant decisions made in capitals. These kinds of losses do not appear in casualty lists, but they shape history by preparing minds and hearts for future confrontations. What makes this late stage of the Pig War especially suspenseful is knowing what lies just beyond it in history. The conflict officially came to an end in 1909, but its consequences did not. Instead, it left behind sharper nationalism, deeper resentment, and a political atmosphere ready to ignite when the next crisis appeared. Only a few years later, in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo became the spark that set Europe ablaze, and many of the tensions behind that event had roots in earlier conflicts like the Pig War. The blockade of pigs had turned into a blockade of trust. Tariffs had turned into threats. Economic rivalry had turned into political hostility. The Pig War may not have included armies marching or trenches being dug, but it was part of the long road that led Europe into World War I. When the Pig War finally drew to its close in 1909, it did not end with cheers or celebrations, but with the quiet realization that nothing between Serbia and Austria-Hungary would ever be the same again. Borders reopened, tariffs shifted, and trade technically resumed, but the years of confrontation had carved a deep line of bitterness into both nations. Serbia emerged from the conflict stronger, more self-reliant, and far more determined to shape its own destiny in the Balkans. Its trade network had been diversified, its industries had developed, and its leaders had learned that economic dependence was a dangerous weakness. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, realized that its attempt to punish Serbia economically had failed and had instead created a more confident opponent. The damage done was invisible yet powerful. Distrust had hardened into hostility, and rivalry had become part of national identity on both sides. In the aftermath, the story of the Pig War lived on not just in history books, but in the attitudes of politicians, soldiers, and ordinary citizens. Serbia now saw Austria-Hungary not as a partner but as an obstacle that stood in the way of national growth, territorial ambitions, and access to the sea. Austria-Hungary saw Serbia as a persistent threat, a center of rising Slavic nationalism that could destabilize the empire from within. Every diplomatic exchange after 1909 carried the shadow of those tariff years. It became easier for leaders to imagine conflict and harder for them to imagine compromise. The Balkans, already known for tension, now contained two neighbors whose relationship had been poisoned by economic warfare. In this way, the Pig War continued even after it officially ended, living on in suspicions, speeches, and strategic planning. The true legacy of the Pig War was not measured in livestock or trade figures, but in how it reshaped the political psychology of the region. Serbia became convinced that survival required strength, alliances, and independence from Austrian control. It deepened its ties with Russia and Western Europe, hoping that powerful friends would protect it in future crises. It also strengthened nationalist ideas about uniting Slavic lands, especially Bosnia, which remained under Austro-Hungarian rule. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, tightened its grip on its territories and watched Serbia with growing unease. The empire's leaders feared that Serbian influence might inspire rebellions among their own Slavic populations, threatening the survival of the Habsburg state. Because of this fear, every Serbian move was interpreted as hostile, and every Austrian decision confirmed Serbian suspicions. The Pig War had built a bridge straight toward the crises that followed. Looking back, we can see clearly that this Tariff conflict was one of the many stepping stones on the path toward the First World War. It hardened alliances, deepened divisions, and proved that the Balkans could drag the great powers of Europe into broader confrontations. The Bosnian annexation crisis, the rise of nationalist groups, and eventually the assassination in Sarajevo all unfolded in an atmosphere shaped in part by the memory of Austria-Hungary's attempt to economically strangle Serbia and Serbia's refusal to submit. The Pig War showed that even when guns are silent, nations can still fight wars through pressure, trade blockades, and political intimidation. And those silent wars can be just as dangerous because they quietly prepare hearts and minds for future violence. What began with pigs and tariffs ended by contributing to the greatest military conflict the world had seen up to that time. Today, the Pig War stands as a reminder that history is often moved not only by armies on battlefields but also by economic decisions made in government offices, by trade routes closed and opened, and by pride and ambition hidden behind official language. It teaches us how fragile relationships between nations can be, and how quickly economic disputes can grow into political crises with far-reaching consequences. The story is suspenseful because at every moment people living through it did not know what would happen next. They only knew that their markets were changing, their alliances were shifting, and their leaders were speaking with sharper tones. In that uncertainty lay the seeds of larger conflict, and the Pig War became one of those quiet storms that shape the future without anyone noticing until it is too late. And now, as we reach the end of this narration, here is a note directly for you, the viewer. If you feel that our videos are helping you understand real history more clearly, if you enjoy learning about the hidden politics, dramatic conflicts, and powerful stories behind great battles and wars, then we invite you to stay connected with us. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and press the bell notification button so you never miss the latest episodes in our War History series. Your support encourages us to keep bringing you accurate, engaging, and well-researched content from world history, and together we will continue exploring the events that shaped our world.